The evidence from the research is telling us to get the greatest benefits from exercise, the goal is to do 150 minutes of exercise per week. This is the amount that has been worked out to have the best results in the management of Parkinson's. That 150 minutes is best done in 5 30-minute bouts, and we're looking to reach a moderate to vigorous intensity. Remember that this is a target to work towards if you're not there now. 150 minutes per week is an aim. If you haven't exercised much before, start with low to moderate intensity exercise and build from there. Start with just a few minutes and build up to the 30 minutes or more over time. Once we create the habit, we can then build on that habit. We talk about intensity a lot. Let's have a quick look at what we mean. The core categories are light, moderate, and vigorous. And when it comes to Parkinson's, we particularly focus in on the range that increases from moderate to vigorous. When we talk about intensity here, we are talking about how hard we're working. That is our level of exertion. There are several ways we can measure our intensity. One way is to measure our heart rate. The harder we work, the faster our heart rate. Alternative and more accessible methods use our perceived exertion. That is how hard we feel our body is working. It turns out that these are really good measures of our intensity. There are 2 great methods that we may want to choose between. The Borg rating of perceived exertion. You might hear it called the Borg scale or RPE. This is the scale from 6 to 20, where 6 is no exertion at all, and 7 to 11 is a steady progression through light intensity exercise. We're interested in the scale from 12 upwards. It's a great tool when we have some practice in using it. Perhaps the most accessible is the talk test. Here, we measure how our intensity or exertion is affecting our breathing. The rule of thumb is, if we can talk, hello, how are you? La la, but not sing, we're working at a moderate level. If we're not able to say more than a few words without pausing for a breath, we'll be working at a vigorous intensity. The key point to mention here, whichever tool we use to measure it, our level of intensity is personal to each one of us. For any exercise, each one of us will have our own experience of it. To demonstrate, here I am and here is Mary. She's an international and Olympic level athlete. Let's take an exercise as an example and take a look at mine and Mary's intensity meters to see what happens for each of us. We may look at this and be able to predict what's going to happen here. Sure enough, as I set off doing this exercise, my exertion rapidly rises to vigorous. Even though I'm keeping the size and speed of the movement exactly the same as Mary. In contrast, Mary levels off at the border between light and moderate exertion levels. She needs to increase the work required to push herself into the moderate and vigorous levels. Let's take a look at what we can do to vary intensity levels. First, it's worth saying that almost any exercise done for long enough will eventually feel like we can't go on any longer, and as though we are using maximal energy to keep going. That is part of the story, but we are looking to measure our intensity on a much shorter time scale, more in the minutes and even seconds. So there are 2 main ways we can increase the intensity that we're working at. The first one is speed of movement. If we keep the movement the same and increase the speed at which we do it, we will increase the intensity we're working at. The second is adding a resistance, like a weight, a band, or uphill or upstairs for walking or running. That will also make us work harder for any given movement. It's worth noting that we can also increase challenge by making the movement more complicated or adding a thinking challenge, like counting backwards in 3s from 100. So, with all of that said, what are the things to include in our 150 minutes? The ideal weekly program will include heart pumping, lung puffing cardiorespiratory exercise. When it comes to this, aim at 3 or more times a week when it's vigorous, or 5 or more if it's moderate. Again, this is the goal. You might find it best to start with smaller bouts of lower intensity activity. You can then add to them by doing them more often, like a couple of times in a day. You can then make them longer and increase the intensity over time as your body adapts and you get fitter. To develop our strength, look to include this 2 to 3 days per week. Start steady, and as your strength and skills develop, you can add intensity by adding resistance and doing more repetitions. These are the two main categories that will make up the moderate to vigorous intensity exercise. We can then either add on top or integrate the neuromotor exercises. These are the exercises that develop our motor skills, such as posture training, balance, coordination, gait, and agility. And we include multitasking in this too. These are the exercises that we mentioned that add challenge to the intensity. We can then add on top stretching. They are exercises that develop our flexibility and range of motion. We can spread that across our week, doing it at least 3 times a week and doing it daily to get the most from it. Good luck and happy exercising.